The dust from Clara Bennett's worn boots hadn't even settled on the wooden planks of Henderson's general store before the proprietor's wife was shaking her head with that pinched expression that said everything Clara needed to know about her chances of getting credit in this godforsaken Montana Territory town. Clara stood there in the dim morning light filtering through the store's grimy windows, her hands clutching the small leather purse that contained exactly $3.17, which was nowhere near enough to buy the supplies she desperately needed to get through the coming weeks. Her father had died 6 months ago, leaving her alone on their failing homestead just outside of Silver Creek, and every day since had been a battle against hunger, loneliness, and the harsh realities of trying to survive as a single woman in 1876. "I'm sorry, Miss Bennett, but we simply cannot extend credit to unmarried women," Mrs. Henderson said, her thin lips barely moving as she spoke. "It's store policy. Perhaps if you had a male relative who could co-sign." "My father is dead, as you well know," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've been buying from this store for 23 years. My father always paid his debts." "That may be so, but you are not your father." Mrs. Henderson's eyes flickered with something that might have been sympathy but looked more like satisfaction. "Perhaps you should consider finding employment in town, or better yet, finding a husband." The words stung like a slap across the face, but Clara refused to give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She had cried enough in the past 6 months to fill the Missouri River. Instead, she straightened her spine, tucked a strand of dark brown hair behind her ear, and turned toward the door, her empty basket swinging uselessly at her side. The September morning air hit her face as she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. She'd come to town with a list of necessities: flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, ammunition for the rifle, and without credit, she would be going home with almost nothing. Winter was coming, and she was woefully unprepared. Clara was so lost in her desperate thoughts that she didn't notice the massive figure leaning against the post outside the store until she nearly walked straight into him. She looked up and found herself staring at the broadest chest she had ever seen, covered in a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt that strained against muscles that looked like they had been carved from the very mountains that surrounded Silver Creek. "Pardon me," she mumbled, trying to step around him, but he shifted slightly, not blocking her path exactly, but making it clear he wanted her attention. "Heard what happened in there," he said, and his voice was like distant thunder, deep and rumbling. "That ain't right." Clara finally looked at his face and felt her breath catch. He had strong, angular features that looked weathered by sun and wind, with a jaw covered in dark stubble and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His hair fell past his shoulders, dark brown with hints of copper in the morning light, and everything about him spoke of raw, untamed strength. This was not a man who lived in town or worked behind a desk. This was a man who survived in the wilderness, who wrestled bears and felled trees with his bare hands, or so it seemed. "Life rarely is," Clara said, finding her voice. "But I appreciate your concern, Mr. Donovan, Jack Donovan." He straightened to his full height, which had to be well over 6 feet, and Clara felt small in comparison, though she was not a short woman herself. "I trap up in the mountains, trade furs, come into town maybe once a month for supplies." "Well, Mr. Donovan, unless you have a solution to store credit policies that discriminate against women, I'll be on my way." She tried to move past him again, but his hand shot out, not grabbing her, but holding up a finger as if asking for just one more moment. "Wait here," he said, and before she could respond, he had turned and walked into Henderson's general store, ducking slightly to fit his considerable frame through the doorway. Clara stood there, confused and curious despite herself. She could hear voices inside, Jack Donovan's deep rumble mixing with Mr. Henderson's higher-pitched responses and his wife's sharp interjections. The conversation went on for several minutes, and Clara was just about to leave when Jack emerged, followed by Mr. Henderson himself, who was wiping his hands on his apron and looking slightly flustered. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Henderson said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It seems there has been a misunderstanding. We would be happy to extend credit to you after all. Mr. Donovan here has opened an account in your name and provided assurance for your purchases." Clara's mouth fell open. "He did what?" $50 credit, Jack said casually, as if he had just commented on the weather. Should be enough to get you through winter, I reckon. I cannot possibly accept that, Clara said immediately, her cheeks flushing hot. I don't even know you, Mr. Donovan. Why would you do such a thing? Because you need it, and they were being unreasonable, he said simply. Consider it a loan between neighbors. You can pay me back when you're able, or not. Makes no difference to me. It makes every difference to me, Clara said, her voice rising slightly. I am not a charity case, Mr. Donovan, and I will not be indebted to a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned. Something flickered in Jack's stormy eyes, something that might have been respect. Didn't figure you for a charity case. Figured you for a woman who got dealt a bad hand and could use a little help, same as any person might need from time to time. But if your pride is more important than eating this winter, I suppose that's your choice to make. The words hit home because they were true, and Clara hated that they were true. She closed her eyes briefly, doing quick calculations in her head. She needed supplies. She had no way to get them without credit or significantly more money than she possessed. This man, this stranger, had offered her a lifeline, and refusing it out of pride would be foolish, possibly even fatal. I will pay you back, she said firmly, opening her eyes and meeting his gaze directly. Every cent with interest, if that's what you require. I don't know how long it will take, but I will pay you back. No interest, Jack said. Just the amount when you can manage it. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. Shall we get your order then, Miss Bennett? Clara nodded slowly, still looking at Jack Donovan, trying to understand what kind of man would do this for a stranger. In her experience, men didn't do favors without expecting something in return. But there was nothing in his expression that suggested he wanted anything from her beyond the eventual repayment of the money. Thank you, she said quietly, and he nodded once before stepping aside to let her return to the store. The next hour passed in a blur as Clara carefully selected her supplies, still trying to be as frugal as possible even with the credit available. She bought flour and cornmeal, salt and sugar, coffee and tea, lamp oil and candles, ammunition for hunting, fabric for repairing her worn clothes, and a few small luxuries she had been denying herself for months, including a small tin of honey and a package of real soap that smelled like lavender. Mr. Henderson tallied everything up with a much more pleasant demeanor than his wife had shown earlier. The total came to $32.50, leaving her with credit remaining. As he loaded the supplies into a crate, Clara realized she faced another problem she had walked to town, as her father's old horse had gone lame weeks ago, and she had no way to transport all these goods back to her homestead. I can make 2 trips, she said, more to herself than anyone else, calculating how long it would take to walk the 5 miles back to her property, drop off half the supplies, and return for the rest. I've got a wagon, came that now familiar deep voice from behind her, and Clara jumped slightly. She had thought Jack Donovan had left, but apparently he had remained nearby, watching from somewhere in the store. I'll take you home. Mr. Donovan, you've already done more than enough, Clara protested. It's on my way, he said, which Clara suspected was a lie, but she was too tired and too grateful to argue further. Then I accept. Thank you. Jack's wagon was exactly what she would have expected from a mountain man, sturdy, practical, and clearly built to handle rough terrain. The 2 horses hitched to it were massive creatures, strong and calm, and they barely flicked an ear as Jack loaded her supplies into the back with an ease that made the heavy crates look weightless. He helped her up onto the bench seat with one hand, his grip firm and warm even through her sleeve, and then he climbed up beside her, taking up considerably more than half the available space. Clara found herself very aware of his proximity, of the heat radiating from his large frame, of the way his muscles shifted beneath his shirt as he gathered the reins. They rode in silence through Silver Creek's main street, past the saloon where tinny piano music already drifted through the swinging doors despite the early hour, past the church with its whitewashed steeple, past the marshal's office and the assayer's office, and all the other buildings that made up this small Montana Territory settlement. How far? Jack asked as they left town behind, heading onto the rutted road that led west toward the mountains. About 5 miles, Clara said. There's a fork in the road about 3 miles out. Take the left path. He nodded, and silence fell again, but it was not uncomfortable. Clara found herself stealing glances at him, studying his profile as he drove. There was something inherently peaceful about him, despite his imposing size, a stillness that suggested he was comfortable with silence, comfortable with himself. She wondered how old he was, perhaps 30, perhaps a bit younger or older. It was hard to tell with the weathering on his face. "You live alone up in the mountains?" she asked finally, curious despite herself. "Have a cabin about 10 miles north of here, up where the pine trees get thick," he said. "Been there 5 years now. Came out from Ohio after the war." "You fought?" "Union side," he confirmed. "Saw enough of people and cities and civilization to last me a lifetime. Figured I'd find some peace in the wilderness." "And have you? Found peace?" He was quiet for a long moment, guiding the horses around a particularly rough section of road. "Some days more than others. It's a hard life, but it's honest. No politics, no pretending to be something you're not. Just you and the mountain and whatever you can make of it." Clara understood that sentiment more than he probably realized. "My father brought us out here when I was 3 years old," she said. "My mother died 2 years later, fever. He raised me himself, taught me everything he knew about surviving out here. He used to say the same thing about honest living. You must miss him." "Every day," Clara admitted, surprised at how easily the words came. She had not talked about her father with anyone since his death, had kept her grief locked tight inside. He was a good man, stubborn and set in his ways, but good. What happened to him? "His heart gave out," Clara said quietly. "He went to bed one night and didn't wake up. The doctor said it was probably quick, that he didn't suffer. I suppose that's some comfort." Jack nodded slowly. "That's a hard thing, losing your last family." "Do you have family, Mr. Donovan?" "Jack," he corrected. "And no, not anymore. Parents died before the war, and I had a younger brother who was killed at Shiloh. Nothing waiting for me back in Ohio, which made heading west an easy choice." They rode on, and Clara found herself feeling a strange kinship with this man. They were both alone in the world, both trying to carve out an existence in this harsh territory, both survivors in their own ways. The fork in the road appeared, and Jack guided the horses left without needing to be told. The path here was rougher, barely more than 2 ruts through the grassland, but the wagon handled it well. Another 2 miles passed, and then Clara's property came into view, a small log cabin her father had built with his own hands, a barn that was listing slightly to one side and needed repairs, a few outbuildings, and beyond it all, the mountains rising like sentinels against the blue sky. "It's not much," Clara said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the state of her homestead. The fields that should have been full of crops were sparse and weedy, the fence around the garden was falling down in places, and everything had an air of neglect that she knew had accumulated since her father's death. "It's honest," Jack said, echoing his earlier words, and somehow that made Clara feel better. He pulled the wagon up close to the cabin and began unloading her supplies with the same easy strength he had shown in town. Clara tried to help, but he waved her off for the heavier items, and she focused on carrying the lighter packages inside while he handled the flour sacks and other substantial loads. Her cabin was small but tidy, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, a narrow bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves that held her meager possessions. She directed Jack to set the food supplies on the table and the ammunition on the shelf near the door. When everything was unloaded, he stood in her doorway, having to duck his head slightly to avoid hitting the frame, and Clara realized she should offer him something for his trouble. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "It's the least I can do." "I should get back," Jack said, but there was a hesitation in his voice. "Please," Clara said. "You've been very kind to me today, Mr. Donovan. Jack, let me offer you some small hospitality in return." He considered this, then nodded. "Coffee would be welcome." Clara set about building up the fire in the stove and putting her battered coffee pot on to boil. She had no fresh bread to offer, but she did have some biscuits she had made 2 days ago that were still edible, and she set those out on a plate, along with a small portion of the honey she had just bought. Jack sat at her table, looking comically large in the small chair, and accepted the coffee and biscuits with a quiet thank you. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Clara worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Well, why did you really help me today? You don't know me, and as your kindness has illustrated, I have no way to guarantee I can repay you." Jack took a long sip of coffee, seeming to consider his answer carefully. "I've been watching you," he said finally, and when Clara's eyes widened, He held up a hand. Not in a strange way. I've seen you in town a few times over the past months, seen how you carry yourself. You work hard, you keep your head up, and you don't ask anyone for anything. Today, I saw you get denied something you had every right to have just because you're a woman alone. It wasn't right, and I was in a position to do something about it, so I did. That's all. That's not all, Clara said softly. Men don't usually help women without expecting something in return. Jack's jaw tightened slightly. I'm not most men. I don't want anything from you except maybe to know that you'll make it through winter without starving. If that makes me strange, so be it. Clara studied him, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motive, but all she saw was honesty in those storm-gray eyes. Thank you, she said finally. Truly. You may have saved my life today, and I won't forget that. You would have found a way, Jack said. Women like you always do. He finished his coffee and stood, and Clara walked him outside to his wagon. The sun was higher now, warming the September morning, and in the distance she could hear the cry of a hawk circling above the mountains. Will you come back? Clara asked, then felt her cheeks flush. To check on the repayment, I mean, to see when I might be able to start paying you back. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Jack's mouth. I might stop by from time to time, see how you're managing, if that would be acceptable to you. It would be, Clara said, and realized she meant it. The loneliness of the past months had been crushing at times, and the idea of having someone check in occasionally was more appealing than she wanted to admit. Jack climbed up onto his wagon and gathered the reins. You take care of yourself, Clara Bennett. Keep that rifle loaded and don't trust strangers. Even mountain men who open credit accounts for women they don't know. Especially those, Jack said, and this time he definitely smiled before clicking to his horses and turning the wagon back toward the road. Clara stood watching until he disappeared from view, then turned back to her cabin, feeling something shift in her chest. For the first time in 6 months, she felt something other than grief and desperation. She felt hope. The following weeks passed in a blur of hard work as Clara threw herself into preparing for winter. She used some of her remaining credit to purchase seeds for a late-season crop of hardy vegetables, repaired the garden fence using wire and determination, and spent long days hunting small game to supplement her food stores. The supplies Jack had helped her obtain made an enormous difference, and she found herself thinking of him often as she cooked meals with real flour and good coffee. True to his word, Jack returned 2 weeks after their first meeting. Clara was outside chopping wood when she heard the sound of hooves and looked up to see him riding toward her cabin on a massive bay horse that suited him perfectly. Her heart gave an unexpected jump at the sight of him, and she had to force herself to finish her swing before setting down the axe. "Afternoon," Jack called as he dismounted. He was wearing the same leather vest and worn shirt, and his hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing more of his strong features. "Good afternoon," Clara said, suddenly aware of how she must look, sweaty and covered in wood chips, her hair falling out of its pins. "I wasn't expecting you." "Probably should have sent word," Jack said, "but I don't exactly have an address to write to. Thought I'd check in, see how you're doing." "I'm managing well," Clara said, gesturing to the neat stack of firewood she'd been accumulating. "Thanks to your help, I've been able to focus on preparing for winter rather than worrying about my next meal." Jack's eyes scanned her property, taking in the repaired fence, the small vegetable garden starting to sprout, the general air of improvement. "You've been busy." "Idle hands and all that," Clara said. "Would you like to come inside? I just baked bread this morning." His face lit up in a way that made him look younger, almost boyish. "Fresh bread? I'd like that very much. Haven't had fresh bread in months." Over bread and butter, Clara found herself telling Jack about her plans for the homestead, about her hopes to eventually get some chickens and maybe a milk cow, about the repairs the barn needed before snow came. He listened intently, offering suggestions when appropriate, but mostly just letting her talk. It felt good to share her thoughts with someone, to have a sounding board for her ideas. "How's the trapping?" Clara asked eventually, realizing she'd been monopolizing the conversation. "Starting to pick up," Jack said. "Beaver pelts are bringing good prices this year, and I found a valley about a day's ride north that's full of them. Should be a good winter if I can work it right." "It sounds like lonely work." "It is," Jack admitted, "but I'm used to it. Spent most of my life alone in one way or another. Even before the war? Jack was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his large hands. My parents worked from dawn to dusk on their farm. My brother was 8 years younger than me, so we didn't have much in common until I was nearly grown. I learned early on how to keep my own company. I understand that, Clara said. It was just my father and me for so long, and he wasn't much for talking. I learned to find peace in solitude. But you don't like it much, do you? Jack's eyes were perceptive, seeing more than Clara had intended to reveal. No, she admitted. I've discovered I don't like it much at all. There's a difference between choosing solitude and having it forced upon you. Jack nodded slowly. There is indeed. He stayed for another hour, and before he left, he insisted on finishing the wood chopping for her, despite her protests. She watched him work, unable to help but admire the fluid motion of his powerful body as he split log after log with seemingly effortless swings of the axe. He made it look easy, though Clara knew from her own attempts that it was anything but. I'll come back in a couple of weeks, Jack said as he prepared to leave, if that's all right with you. I'd like that, Clara said, and felt her heart skip when he smiled at her. Over the following months, Jack's visits became a regular occurrence. Sometimes he came every 2 weeks, sometimes 3, depending on his trapping schedule and the weather. Each time he stayed a little longer, talking more freely, helping with whatever projects Clara was working on. He fixed her barn roof before the first snow, reinforced her cabin door when he noticed it was hanging loose, and even helped her build a proper chicken coop in preparation for the spring when she hoped to purchase some hens. Clara found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She would catch herself watching the road, hoping to see his tall figure riding toward her property. She started keeping her cabin extra tidy, baking bread or making stew on days she thought he might appear. She even used some of her precious remaining credit to buy fabric to make herself a new dress, something nicer than the worn work clothes she lived in. December brought heavy snows to Montana territory, and Jack's visits became less frequent by necessity. When he did manage to make it through, he often stayed longer, sometimes helping her clear snow from her roof or chop through ice in her well. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond practical matters to philosophy and dreams, and the things they had experienced in their lives. It was during one of these winter visits, with a blizzard howling outside and the two of them huddled close to her fireplace, that Clara realized she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Jack Donovan. The realization struck her like lightning, sudden and illuminating. She loved the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her words mattered. She loved his quiet strength, the way he never showed off his considerable physical power, but used it to help rather than intimidate. She loved his rare smiles, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the rumble of his laughter when she said something amusing. She loved everything about him, and the intensity of her feelings terrified her. What if he didn't feel the same? What if he saw her only as a charity case, someone to check on out of obligation? What if she revealed her feelings and ruined the friendship they had built? "You've gone quiet," Jack said, breaking into her thoughts. They were sitting on the floor near the fire, having run out of places to sit in her small cabin, and he was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Just thinking," Clara said, not quite meeting his eyes. "About anything you want to share?" She almost said no, almost laughed it off and changed the subject. But something about the warmth of the fire, the intimacy of the storm, keeping them isolated from the rest of the world, and the accumulated months of growing feelings gave her courage. "Jack," she said softly, finally looking at him, "why do you really keep coming back here?" His expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "I told you. To check on you, make sure you're managing all right." "That's what you told me," Clara agreed. "But is that truly the only reason? Because if it is, I need to know. I need to understand where I stand with you." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Jack's jaw worked as if he was wrestling with something internal, and Clara held her breath, terrified she had just made a terrible mistake. "No," he said finally, his voice rough. "That's not the only reason. Hasn't been for months now, if I'm being honest." "Then what is the reason?" Clara pressed, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. Jack turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I come back because I can't stay away. Because I think about you every damn day when I'm up in those mountains alone. Because I've spent my whole life being perfectly content with solitude, and then I met you, and suddenly, solitude feels like the loneliest thing in the world." "Jack?" Clara breathed, barely able to believe what she was hearing. "I know I shouldn't feel this way," he continued, the words tumbling out now as if a dam had broken. "You've been through so much, and you're trying to build a life here, and the last thing you need is some rough mountain man complicating things. But I can't help how I feel, Clara. I'm in love with you. I think I have been since that first day in town when you stood up so straight and proud, even though they were treating you unfairly." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming emotion. "You're not complicating anything," she said, her voice shaking. "You're the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember. I love you too, Jack. I think I've loved you for months, but I was too afraid to say it." The expression on Jack's face transformed, hope and joy and disbelief all mixing together. "You mean that?" "Every word," Clara said, and then his hand was cupping her cheek, rough and gentle all at once, and he was leaning toward her, and she was closing the distance between them. And then they were kissing. It was not a gentle first kiss. It was months of longing and loneliness pouring out, desperate and hungry and perfect. Jack's arms came around her, pulling her close against his broad chest, and Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, threading her fingers through his long hair. He was so warm, so solid, so real, and she never wanted this moment to end. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you proper, marry you if you'll have me." "I'll have you," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I'll absolutely have you, Jack Donovan." "Then we'll do this right," he repeated. "I'll talk to the minister in town, and we can be married before spring if you're willing." "I'm willing," Clara said, and kissed him again to prove it. The blizzard kept Jack at her cabin for 3 days, and those were the happiest 3 days Clara had experienced in as long as she could remember. They talked for hours, making plans for their future together. Jack wanted to bring Clara to his mountain cabin, which was larger and more secure than her homestead, but Clara was hesitant to leave the land her father had worked so hard to establish. In the end, they compromised. They would spend winters at Jack's cabin where they would be safer from the worst storms and closer to his trap lines, and summers at Clara's homestead where they would plant crops and raise chickens and build the life Clara had envisioned. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it felt right, honoring both their needs. When the storm finally cleared, Jack rode back to his cabin with promises to return within a week. Clara watched him go with a heart so full she thought it might burst, and then she went inside and began planning their wedding. True to his word, Jack returned 6 days later with news that he had spoken to Reverend Matthews in Silver Creek and arranged for them to be married on Christmas Eve. It was less than 2 weeks away, but Clara didn't care. She had waited long enough for happiness. She wasn't interested in waiting any longer. She used the last of her store credit to purchase fabric for a simple wedding dress, pale blue wool that would be practical as well as pretty. Mrs. Henderson, who had been considerably more pleasant to Clara since Jack's involvement in her credit arrangement, even offered to help with the sewing, and Clara accepted with surprised gratitude. The news of their engagement spread through Silver Creek faster than wildfire, and Clara found herself the recipient of unexpected kindness from the townspeople. Women she barely knew stopped by her cabin with small gifts, a jar of preserves, a set of linen napkins, a hand-embroidered handkerchief. It seemed that the romantic story of the mountain man and the homesteader girl had captured the town's imagination, and Clara found herself embraced by a community she had felt excluded from just months before. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow covering everything in a pristine blanket of white. Clara dressed carefully in her new blue dress, pinned her dark hair up with the silver combs that had belonged to her mother, and stood before the small mirror in her cabin, barely recognizing the happy woman staring back at her. Jack arrived an hour before the ceremony, driving a sleigh he had borrowed from someone in town. He wore new clothes, a dark suit that must have cost him dearly and fit his large frame perfectly. His hair was trimmed slightly shorter, but still fell past his collar, and his face was clean-shaven for the first time since Clara had known him. He looked devastatingly handsome, and Clara felt her breath catch when she saw him. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "And you're very handsome," Clara replied, reaching up to touch his smooth jaw. "Though I admit I'll miss the beard a bit." "It'll grow back," Jack promised, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Are you ready for this?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Clara said truthfully. The wedding took place in Silver Creek's small church, which was decorated with pine boughs and candles for Christmas. Nearly the entire town turned out, filling the pews to witness the marriage of the mountain man and the woman he had saved with his unexpected kindness. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed Clara with a tenderness that made her heart overflow. The small congregation erupted in applause, and Clara found herself laughing and crying simultaneously as Jack lifted her clear off her feet in his enthusiasm. The town had organized a small reception at the saloon, which had been temporarily converted into a more respectable venue for the occasion. There was food and music and dancing, and Clara found herself passed from partner to partner as various townsmen claimed dances with the bride. But her eyes kept returning to Jack, who stood along the wall watching her with such love in his expression that she felt it like a physical touch. Finally, as the evening wore on, Jack claimed her for a dance. His hands were gentle on her waist and hand, and despite his size, he moved with surprising grace. "Ready to go home?" he murmured in her ear. "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. They slipped away from the celebration and climbed into the borrowed sleigh. Jack had packed it earlier with Clara's belongings, and now he drove them north out of Silver Creek toward the mountains and his cabin and their new life together. The ride took several hours, but Clara didn't mind. She was wrapped in warm furs that Jack had provided, tucked close against his side, watching the moonlight reflect off the snow-covered landscape. Everything was beautiful and peaceful and perfect. Jack's cabin appeared as they crested a ridge, nestled in a small valley surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Clara had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney from which smoke was rising. Someone, probably a friend of Jack's, had clearly come out to light the fire and prepare the cabin for their arrival. Jack helped Clara down from the sleigh and carried her over the threshold in the traditional manner, making her laugh with delight. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, with a large fireplace, a proper kitchen area, a sturdy table and chairs, and in the corner, a wide bed covered in furs and quilts. "Welcome home, Mrs. Donovan," Jack said, setting Clara on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "It feels like home already," Clara said, and meant it. Anywhere with Jack would feel like home. That night they consummated their marriage with a passion that left Clara breathless and amazed. Jack was tender and patient, making sure she was comfortable and cared for, and when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Afterward, they lay entwined beneath the warm covers, talking and laughing and reveling in the joy of being together without reservation or fear. The winter that followed was the happiest time of Clara's life. She and Jack settled into an easy rhythm, working together to maintain the cabin, check his trap lines, and simply enjoy each other's company. Jack taught her how to snowshoe and track animals through the winter forest. Clara taught him how to make proper bread and mend clothes with neat, invisible stitches. They read to each other from the small collection of books Jack had accumulated, played cards by the fireplace, and made love with increasing confidence and joy. As the months passed, Clara found herself amazed at how well they fit together. Jack's quiet strength complemented her determined independence. His patience balanced her occasional impulsiveness. They rarely argued, and when they did, they worked through their disagreements with respect and communication. Spring came to the mountains in late April, bringing melting snow and the first green shoots of new growth. Jack and Clara made the journey back to her homestead, which had weathered the winter well thanks to Jack's preparations the previous fall. They spent the next weeks planting an ambitious garden, repairing the barn completely, and building the chicken coop they had planned. In May, Clara realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another month to be sure, then told Jack her suspicions on a warm June evening as they sat on the porch of her cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "I think I'm with child," she said quietly, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Jack's eyes widened, and then a smile spread across his face that was brighter than any Clara had seen. Truly? I think so. It's still early, but all the signs are there. Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt his shoulders shake with emotion. A baby, he whispered. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy? Clara asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Jack said, pulling back to look at her with shining eyes. I never thought I'd have a family, never thought I'd find someone to share my life with, and now I have you, and we're going to have a child. Clara, I'm the luckiest man in Montana Territory. We're both lucky, Clara said, touching his face gently. We found each other when we both needed someone most. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. Clara's belly grew round and full, and Jack was attentively protective, constantly worrying about her health and comfort. He insisted they return to his mountain cabin in October, well before her November due date, so that she would be settled and comfortable when her time came. He rode into Silver Creek and brought back the town's midwife, Mrs. Patterson, a capable woman in her 50s who had delivered hundreds of babies. She agreed to stay with them for the last month of Clara's pregnancy, and her presence was reassuring even though Clara felt strong and healthy. In late November, just after the first significant snowfall, Clara went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Clara thought she couldn't endure anymore. But Jack was there through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement and love. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son was born. He came into the world squalling and healthy, with a thick shock of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Clara held him against her chest and cried with relief and joy and overwhelming love. He's perfect, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion as he touched his son's tiny hand. Absolutely perfect. What should we name him? Clara had been thinking about this for months. Thomas, she said, after my father, Thomas Jack Donovan. Thomas Jack, Jack repeated and nodded. It's a good, strong name. He'll wear it well. Mrs. Patterson stayed for another week to make sure both mother and baby were healthy. Then Jack took her back to town, with generous payment for her services and her discretion. When he returned, it was just the three of them, the new little family, alone in the mountain cabin while winter settled in around them. Those early months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and curious, and watching Jack with his son made Clara fall even more deeply in love with her husband. The big, strong mountain man was impossibly gentle with the tiny infant, cradling him in his massive hands with such care and tenderness that it brought tears to Clara's eyes. They spent a second winter in the mountains, and as Thomas grew from infant to baby, Clara felt her life had achieved a completeness she had never imagined possible. She had a husband who loved her, a beautiful son, and a home, 2 homes actually, that felt safe and secure. When spring came again, they returned to the homestead, and Clara introduced Thomas to the land his grandfather had worked. She told him stories about his namesake, about the strong man who had carved a life out of the wilderness and raised his daughter to be independent and capable. That summer, Jack built an addition onto the homestead cabin, expanding it with 2 more rooms so they would have more space for their growing family. He worked tirelessly through the long summer days, his muscles gleaming with sweat as he felled trees, stripped logs, and fitted them together with expert precision. Clara would sit in the shade, nursing Thomas and watching her husband work, feeling grateful beyond measure for the life they had built. In August, Clara realized she was pregnant again. This time the news was less surprising but no less joyful. Jack was thrilled at the prospect of another child, and Thomas, now 9 months old and starting to pull himself up on furniture, would have a sibling close in age. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Rose, was born the following April during a spectacular spring thunderstorm. Her birth was easier than Thomas's had been, and she came into the world with a full head of reddish-brown hair and her mother's dark eyes. Jack held her and cried openly, overcome with love for his tiny daughter. The years that followed were full and rich. Clara and Jack continued their pattern of spending winters in the mountain cabin and summers at the homestead. Jack's trapping business prospered, and they were able to make improvements to both properties. They added glass windows to the mountain cabin, built a proper barn at the homestead, and even purchased a small herd of cattle that they pastured in the meadow below the homestead. Thomas and Sarah grew strong and healthy, learning to navigate both the wilderness of the mountains and the practical work of the homestead. Jack taught them to track and hunt and survive in the forest. Clara taught them to read and write and do sums, using the books they accumulated and her own memories of lessons from childhood. In the spring of 1883, when Thomas was 6 and Sarah was 5, Clara gave birth to their third and final child, another son they named James. By this time, the family was well established and respected in Silver Creek and the surrounding territory. Jack had become something of a legend, the mountain man with the heart of gold who had saved a widow and built a life with her. Clara occasionally thought back to that morning in Henderson's general store when she had been denied credit and felt her life was spiraling beyond her control. She remembered the desperation, the fear, the crushing loneliness, and then she would look at Jack, at their 3 beautiful children, at the life they had built together through hard work and love and mutual support, and she marveled at how one act of kindness had changed everything. She had long since paid back the $50 Jack had put on credit for her. In fact, she had insisted on paying him back within the first year of their marriage, even though he protested it wasn't necessary. But Clara needed to do it for her own sense of pride and independence, and Jack understood that. The money had come from the sale of her father's old pocket watch to a collector in town, and though it pained her to part with the treasured item, it felt right to close that chapter of her life on her own terms. Now, 7 years after their first meeting, Clara and Jack sat on the porch of the homestead cabin on a warm summer evening, watching their 3 children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Sarah how to skip stones in the creek, while baby James toddled around nearby, investigating rocks and flowers with intense concentration. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked suddenly, reaching over to take Jack's hand. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains for all this chaos?" Jack looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that still made her heart skip, and smiled. "Not for a single second. I thought I wanted solitude, but what I really wanted was peace. And I found peace with you, Clara. You and these children are the best thing that ever happened to me." "Even when Thomas put a snake in your boot last week?" Jack laughed, the deep rumbling sound that Clara loved. "Even then, though I admit I might have preferred a different way of being woken up." Clara leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and content. "I love you, Jack Donovan. Thank you for opening that account for me all those years ago." "Best $50 I ever spent," Jack said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Best investment of my entire life." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, the Donovan family gathered together on the porch. Jack pulled Clara onto his lap, despite her laughing protests about being too heavy, and the children climbed up around them, creating a tangle of arms and legs and love. Clara looked at each face, her husband's strong features, Thomas's curious gray eyes so like his father's, Sarah's sweet smile, James's chubby cheeks, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. She had lost so much when her father died, had felt so alone and desperate and frightened. But that desperation had led her to Jack, or rather, had led Jack to her. Sometimes Clara wondered what would have happened if Jack hadn't been at the store that morning, if he hadn't overheard her being denied credit, if he hadn't decided to intervene. Would she have found another way to survive? Would they have met some other time, some other way? Or would she have remained alone, struggling to make ends meet on her isolated homestead? But those questions didn't matter because Jack had been there. He had heard her, seen her, helped her, and in doing so, had changed both their lives forever. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into love, partnership, and family. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked softly, his arms tightening around her waist. "How grateful I am," Clara said simply, "for all of this. For you." "The gratitude goes both ways," Jack said. "You gave me something I didn't even know I needed. A reason to come down from the mountain, a home, a family, a life worth living beyond just surviving." Thomas, overhearing this, looked up at his father with serious eyes. "Papa, will you tell us again about how you met Mama?" It had become their favorite bedtime story, the tale of how their parents had met. Jack and Clara exchanged amused glances, and then Jack launched into the familiar narrative. Well, it was a September morning in 1876, and I had come into Silver Creek for supplies. I was standing outside Henderson's general store when the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen came walking out with fire in her eyes and determination in every step. "That was Mama," Sarah said happily, as if she hadn't heard this story 100 times before. "That was indeed your Mama," Jack confirmed, "and I heard what had happened inside, how they wouldn't give her credit just because she was a woman alone. Well, I couldn't stand for that kind of injustice." "So you went inside and opened an account for her," Thomas said, picking up the story, "even though you didn't know her." "Even though I didn't know her," Jack agreed, "because it was the right thing to do. And that decision changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." Clara listened to her husband tell their story, watched her children's rapt faces, and felt tears prick her eyes. But they were happy tears, grateful tears, tears of someone who had walked through darkness and emerged into light. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. There were harsh winters and failed crops, illnesses and injuries, moments of fear and frustration. But through it all, Jack and Clara faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing season. Thomas grew into a tall, strong young man, much like his father, with a gift for tracking and survival in the wilderness. He apprenticed with Jack, learning the trapping trade and exploring the mountains they both loved. Sarah developed her mother's determination and practical skills, along with a talent for numbers that suggested she might one day help manage the business side of the family's various enterprises. James, the baby, showed signs of being the most social of the three, always making friends in town and talking about one day becoming a teacher. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, the Donovan family celebrated along with the rest of the territory. They attended the festivities in Silver Creek, now a growing town with a railroad connection and aspirations of becoming a real city. Clara, now 36 years old and still beautiful despite the hard work and mountain sun, stood with Jack, now 41 and still as strong as ever, watching their children dance and laugh with their friends. "Can you believe how much has changed?" Clara asked, thinking back to that desperate morning 13 years ago when she had been a lonely widow with no prospects and no hope. "Some things change," Jack said, pulling her close. "But the important things stay the same. I love you just as much now as I did the day we married. More, actually." "Is that possible?" Clara teased. "With you, anything is possible," Jack said, and kissed her right there in the middle of the town square, making their children groan with embarrassment and making Clara laugh with pure joy. As the years moved into the 1890s, the Donovan children began making their own ways in the world. Thomas married a sweet girl from town named Elizabeth and built his own cabin in the mountains, continuing the trapping tradition his father had established. Sarah surprised everyone by deciding to attend a teacher's college in Helena, determined to get an education and make her own mark on the world. James, true to his nature, stayed close to home, helping his parents manage the homestead, and eventually taking over much of the daily work as Jack and Clara began to slow down with age. Clara and Jack entered their 50s with grace and gratitude. Jack's hair turned silver, though he remained strong and capable. Clara developed lines around her eyes and mouth, marks of a life lived fully, of many smiles and much laughter. They spent more time at the homestead now, finding the journey to the mountain cabin increasingly difficult, though they still made the trip occasionally for old times' sake. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Clara with a gift, a beautiful locket containing tiny photographs of their 3 children. Clara cried when she opened it, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and the reminder of how blessed their lives had been. 20 years, she said, fastening the locket around her neck. "Can you believe it's been 20 years? "Best 20 years of my life," Jack said, "and I look forward to 20 more at least." They would get those 20 years and more. Jack and Clara lived well into their 70s, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching their family grow and spread across Montana. They never forgot their humble beginnings, the desperate morning that brought them together, the leap of faith that changed everything. Clara would sometimes visit Henderson's general store, which was now run by the Hendersons' daughter and her husband. and remember standing at that counter being denied credit. She would remember the shame and fear she felt, the crushing weight of being alone in a world that didn't value women's independence. And then she would remember the deep voice behind her, the massive mountain man who saw injustice and decided to act, who opened an account in her name that same morning and, in doing so, opened the door to a future neither of them could have imagined. On a crisp autumn morning in 1906, Jack and Clara sat together on the porch of their homestead, now expanded and improved beyond recognition from the humble cabin Clara's father had built so many years ago. They were both 73 years old, gray-haired and weathered, but still strong, still together, still deeply in love. Their children were grown with families of their own. Thomas had 4 children and ran a successful trapping and trading business. Sarah had become a teacher and principal at Silver Creek's growing school system, married to a lawyer and mother of 2. James had taken over the homestead completely, married to a rancher's daughter, and was raising 5 children on the land their grandfather had claimed decades ago. "We did all right, didn't we?" Jack said, his voice still deep though rougher with age. "We did better than all right," Clara said, leaning against his shoulder the way she had done for 30 years. "We built something beautiful, Jack. Not just this homestead or your cabin in the mountains, but our family, our life together. That's what's beautiful. It all started with $50 and a stubborn woman who wouldn't accept charity," Jack said, smiling. "Aha, and a kind man who saw someone in need and helped without expecting anything in return," Clara added. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had been the backdrop to their entire life together. The same mountains where Jack had lived alone for 5 years, where he had trapped and survived and been content with solitude. The same mountains that surrounded the homestead, where Clara had struggled alone after her father's death, where she had nearly given up hope. Those mountains had witnessed their meeting, their courtship, their marriage, the births of their children, and all the countless moments of joy and struggle that made up a life. And now, in their twilight years, Jack and Clara found peace in knowing that those mountains would stand long after they were gone, silent sentinels watching over the family they had created and the love story that had started with a simple act of kindness in front of a general store on a September morning in 1876. "I love you, Clara Donovan," Jack said, taking her weathered hand in his own. "From that first moment I saw you walking out of that store with your head held high, I knew you were someone special. Thank you for letting me be part of your life." "I love you, Jack Donovan," Clara replied, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for helping me when I had no right to expect it. Thank you for loving me, for building this life with me, for giving me everything I never knew I needed." As the sun climbed higher, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink, Jack and Clara remained on their porch, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds, 2 lives intertwined through love and commitment and mutual respect. They had weathered 30 years together, had faced every challenge as partners, had celebrated every triumph as one. The store wouldn't give her credit that morning so long ago, but a mountain man had opened an account in her name, and in doing so had opened both their hearts to a love that would last a lifetime. And in the end, that was worth more than all the credit in the world. Their story became legend in Silver Creek and the surrounding territory, passed down through generations of their family and the community they had been part of for so long. It was a story about kindness and courage, about taking chances and believing in people, about how a single moment of compassion could change the course of 2 lives forever. Jack and Clara Donovan lived to see the turn of the century, to see Montana grow from rough territory to established state, to see their children's children begin to have children of their own. And through it all, through every change and every challenge, they remained devoted to each other. Their love as strong in their final years as it had been on that Christmas Eve in 1876 when they had stood before Reverend Matthews and pledged their lives to one another. When Jack finally passed away in the winter of 1909 at the age of 76, surrounded by his family, his last words were of Clara and his gratitude for the life they had shared. Clara held his hand as he slipped away, her heart breaking but also full of thankfulness for the decades they had been given together. She followed him less than a year later, in the autumn of 1910, and the family buried her beside Jack in the small cemetery overlooking Silver Creek. Their headstone, paid for by their children, read simply, "Jack and Clara Donovan, two souls, one love, forever together." And that was how their story ended, as all stories must. But the love they shared, the family they built, and the legacy of kindness that had started it all continued on through their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The homestead remained in the family for generations, a testament to Clara's determination and Jack's support. The mountain cabin where they had spent so many happy winters became a special retreat for the family, a place to remember and honor the couple who had started it all. Years later, when their great-grandchildren would ask about Jack and Clara, the story would be told again of the mountain man and the widow, of the store that wouldn't give credit and the man who opened an account, of how one act of kindness on a September morning in 1876 had started a love story that lasted a lifetime and created a family that spread across Montana and beyond. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth celebrating. Because it was true, and because it reminded everyone who heard it that kindness matters, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes, when we help others, we end up helping ourselves in ways we never could have imagined. Jack Donovan had been a solitary mountain man who thought he wanted to live alone. Clara Bennett had been a desperate widow who thought she had lost everything. Together, they had found something neither knew they were seeking, a love that sustained them through decades of life's joys and hardships, a partnership built on mutual respect and admiration, and a family that would carry their legacy forward long after they were gone. The store wouldn't give her credit that morning, but fate or providence or simple human kindness had provided something far more valuable. A mountain man had opened an account in her name, and in the process had opened both their hearts to a future filled with love, laughter, children, hard work, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived together. And so their story ended, not with sorrow, but with celebration, not with regret, but with gratitude. Jack and Clara Donovan had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. Their love story, born from an act of unexpected kindness in front of a general store in Silver Creek, Montana territory, became the foundation for a family that would grow and thrive, always remembering the mountain man and the woman he helped, who became his wife, his partner, and the love of his life.